Thank you for this wonderful welcome. I'm really glad to be here. I'm honored to be invited, and I'm pleased to be allowed to talk about Saint Antony. He would have never called himself that at all, ever. But I think that just speaks even better to the character of this person. The original title, I think, that I had sent, kind of a provisional title that didn't make it onto the program, which is just as well, because then I could, mold it however I pleased. But I think I sort of tailored this talk to what I had in mind originally for this session. My title is The Flip Side of Martyrdom: Lessons from St. Antony's Long Life with God. The flip side of martyrdom. So, what is the flip side of martyrdom, and what is martyrdom? We could define it as a kind of discipleship that is consummated in death. So the flip side then is a kind of discipleship sustained over one's entire life. Discipleship could then constitute a dying martyrdom or a living martyrdom. In either case, both witness to God's work in and through a person. For a martyr, from the Greek martus, is a witness or one who gives testimony. I think we're pretty familiar with the church's teaching, the church's thinking about martyrdom. The early church is what I'm referring to here. The church venerated the martyrs who shed their blood for the Savior, participating, like Paul in Philippians 3, in the sufferings of Christ, following the pattern of his sufferings in a way that we refer to as imitatio Christi, the imitation of Christ. You might recognize that Thomas à Kempis wrote an entire work that he called Imitation of Christ, and it's a work that is a work of discipleship, right? Advice to disciples. For example, Ignatius of Antioch, on his way to Rome to suffer what is known as a condemnation to the beasts, damnatio ad bestias, he says, "Now is the moment I am beginning to be a disciple." On his way, he says, "Now is the moment I'm beginning to be a disciple. May nothing seen or unseen begrudge me making my way to Jesus Christ. Let me imitate the passion of my God." So the martyrs were the church's great superheroes. They were like the radicals, from books like Radical. They're it. So that's the church's thinking about martyrs. We also know the church is thinking about another class of people called the confessors. And confessors are Christians who had suffered but not died under persecution. Confessors had a special status in the church, even being eligible to hold ecclesiastical offices without being ordained in the usual way. We read in the apostolic tradition of a bishop named Hippolytus of Rome. He says this: "If a confessor has been placed in chains for the name of the Lord, hands are not to be laid upon him for the office of deacon or elder. He has the honor of the office of an elder through his confession." You don't need the authority of the church to say that you're qualified. Your confession and your suffering for the Lord already has qualified you to hold that office. So confessors were marked as special. They were chosen by God to suffer for his name, and by God's grace, they were restored to the church. We even see that they apparently had, or maybe they took it upon themselves, the powers to ask God for special favors, especially when it came to advocating to the clergy for the full restoration of the lapsed. That's what we call those who had somehow compromised themselves in the time of persecution. This situation appears in works like The Passion of Perpetua and Felicitas, if you're familiar with that, as well as in Eusebius's recounting of the martyrdom of those at Lyon and Vienne. So we've got the martyrs and we've got the confessors, but what about you and me? What about the faithful, i.e., the majority, who had not suffered in these ways? Are they not commended for the way or the ways in which they bear witness? Well, Clement of Alexandria, in his work called the Miscellanies, taught that one need not have shed actual blood in order to be considered a martyr in a spiritual sense. Building on the idea of the martyr as witness, Clement wrote, quote, "If a confession to God is martyrdom, so if a confession to God is martyria, then each soul which has lived purely in the knowledge of God, which has obeyed the commandments, is a martus, both by life and word, in whatever way that soul may be released from the body," unquote. So a faithful witness, he says, sheds faith as blood throughout the course of his or her life in public witness of obedient discipleship. Continuing on, Clement distinguishes two kinds of martyrdom: what he calls a simple martyrdom, which is conventionally understood where a person dies for his or her faith, and something he calls a Gnostic martyrdom with a small g, not referring to the heretics, that's big G, Gnostic, big bad Gnostic, but referring to true Christians, like those who truly know, right, the truth about God, the truth of the gospel. So he refers to a Gnostic martyrdom in which a person witnesses by their life. This person, Clement says, has conducted himself according to the rule of the gospel in love to the Lord, so as to leave worldly kindred and wealth and every possession in order to lead a life free from passion. Right? This second century discussion of the meaning of true martyrdom allows the later church to extend the title of martyr to those who exhibit a disciplined, faithful witness even after Christianity is fully accepted in the Roman world. This has a direct bearing on important elements of Antony's life story and how it is framed. And it also has bearing on how the lives of Christians were portrayed and passed down in what we call saints' lives or hagiographies. A later example from Jerome's Life of Paula the Elder describes his friend Paula's life as a martyrdom. He writes to her daughter Eustochium, "Your mother has now, after a long martyrdom, won her crown. It is not only the shedding of blood that is accounted a confession. The spotless service of a devout mind is itself a daily martyrdom. Both alike are crowned," end quote. So, was Antony a martyr? No, and yes. Saint Antony of Egypt was a spiritual superhero in the early church, but he may not be so to the evangelical church now. Yet it is possible and desirable to give a hospitable reading even to foreign or unfamiliar or maybe even off-putting texts in order to understand something about our spiritual forefathers and mothers and their spiritual values and aspirations and the ways in which they followed Jesus in discipleship. I believe it is possible to retrieve truths from these texts without remaking these long ago saints into the evangelical Protestant image. It's very important that we don't do that. Antony lived to the age of 105, and he died a natural death. From his long life with God, I think that we can learn many things and find much to imitate in his discipleship, but I want to focus our time here on 4 lessons, 4 ways in which his life bore witness. And I'll repeat these as we go on as well. The way of discipleship is fill in the blank. The way of discipleship is the way of dying daily. The way of discipleship is a way of humility. The way of discipleship is the way of spiritual struggle. And finally, the way of discipleship is the way of love, of Jesus and neighbor. So let's look a little bit at Antony's life and then turn to what he teaches us 1700 years after his death. And if you've never read the life of Antony, it's this little book right here. I mean, mine looks like it's like 1700 years old. It's received a lot of love. But it takes about maybe 2 hours to sit down and read through it. So it's not really a hard book. It's not a long book, and I think that it's worth your while. It's kind of it sort of breathes an alien air though. So sit with it, be patient with it. Maybe read it more than once. All right. So, well, Antony's life. The evangelical way, since we're talking about ways, is such that we frequently focus on Christianity in culture, Christianity in the cities. We focus on engaging people. We have a very active and social way here in the Evangelical Church and in the Missional Baptist Church, right? In the SBC, sending is our thing, and going and ministering, right? And reaching out and planting, and we're very active. So right now in this time, right here today, we want to look at Christianity a little bit further afield, like past the field, past the city, past the field, and into the desert. The monastic ascetic desert phenomenon in Christianity is frequently a hard sell for evangelicals. And it's not necessary to sell desert Christianity, and I'm not here to sell desert Christianity. I'm into retrieval. I let them be what they are, and we be what we are, right? But it's at least important to understand it in order to understand early Christian spiritual aspirations. I feel like the desert shouldn't be too foreign a concept for Bible reading Christians. The Old Testament tradition of prophets like Elijah and Elisha looms large, along with other prophets in training, like the sons of the prophets that are, out there in the wilderness roving around in bands, right? What are they doing? They're having like a mobile seminary out there, okay? They're studying with the prophets. And these stories of Elijah, Elisha, and their disciples and their doings in the wilderness function a little bit like a parallel narrative to what's going on, in Samaria at the court of the king. Okay. Moses is considered a prophet, and his calling and ministry took place largely, almost exclusively, in the desert, in the wilderness. The New Testament tradition finds association of the desert with significant figures like John the Baptist, the forerunner, the voice crying out in the wilderness. The wilderness was a place of preparation for his ministry, as it was for Jesus as well, who was also training for his ministry, driven by the Spirit into the wilderness for over a month to do battle with the devil at the point where he's physically the weakest in his time in the desert, and who thereafter still got resistance from evil forces throughout his ministry until finally the devil is fully defeated on humans' behalf at the cross and resurrection. But the ministry and the initial defeat of the devil, we might say the initial binding of the strong man, happened in the beginning in the desert. The Apostle Paul also spent some time training in the wilderness, in the regions, he says, of Arabia and Syria, he tells us in Galatians 1 and 2. So all these figures found in this vast, desolate emptiness, in the stillness of the desert, kind of an otherworldly space to be quiet, to be away from people and closer to God, to be away from distractions and external temptations, and to be given an opportunity and actually even an obligation to wrestle with the inner world of one's human turmoil. It's a place to be refined and prepared and trained. So although the desert seems like an empty and abandoned kind of place, the one who goes there to commune with God returns to society full and equipped and ready to share in the abundance of God's blessings, just as Jesus returned from the desert in the power of the Holy Spirit to Galilee, and then he went to teach in the synagogues. This is Luke 4. And Moses returned with his face lit up, returned back to God's people to share the law in Exodus 34. And Paul returned from Arabia and Syria. He went back home to Damascus and to Cilicia, where he was from, preaching the gospel. This is Galatians 1:15-23. So these biblical narratives, but especially the Old Testament narratives of the prophetic work in the wilderness, these stand in the background as a context for a work like the life of Antony. Written soon after his death in AD 356 by the great Alexandrian bishop Athanasius, who is the traditional author of the life of Antony became a best-selling hit, inspiring thousands of people to take up, or at least to desire, an ascetic lifestyle. Even in the time of Jesus, people were attracted to the holy man out in the desert, right? They were attracted to John the Baptist, the holy man in the wilderness. So Jesus remarked, he asked people, what did you go out into the wilderness to see? A reed shaken by the wind? What then did you go out to see? A man dressed in soft clothing? No, he's wearing animal skins, right? Camel hair. What then did you go out to see? A prophet? Yes, I tell you, and more than a prophet. And if you're willing to accept it, he is the Elijah who is to come. It's no wonder then that Antony, isolated as he intentionally was, drew attention because people were attracted to the power of those who venture into the wilderness to be with God. There's a mystique about that, They perceived then, and the perception only strengthened going forward into the 5th and 6th centuries, that the desert monks, the holy men and women, stood in the same spiritual trajectory as the prophets who walked with God, though sometimes, even they are isolated and marginalized and set apart. And the men and women of the desert were led by God's Spirit, and they were also connected to the apostles who preached powerfully and performed miracles in the cities and in house churches and before rulers and governors, still by the power of the same Spirit. So the prophets and the apostles were seen to be kind of the line in which these men and women of the desert stood. So the life, it's a certain literary genre called hagiography, the life of a saint, holy writing. And it's related to martyrologies of the kind that we mentioned, like the martyrdom of Perpetua and Felicity, or you might be familiar with the martyrdom of Polycarp. Okay, so those are martyrologies. They tell the stories of these martyrdoms. And these hagiographies, these lives of saints, are the successors of the martyrologies. This life of a holy man that Athanasius writes has a purpose for him. Rather than constructing a rule with precepts for those who want to pursue ascetic desert monasticism, and there were a lot of people who wanted to, because ascetic practice already had a respectable cultural reputation among philosophers, in addition to its biblical association. So it was attractive to Christians. Athanasius offers a life. So instead of a rule, he offers a life. Instead of a manual, he gives a person. He offers a life by which to teach. And through this life, we learn what makes a holy man and what makes a man and a woman holy. So what does make one holy? Well, the answer given in the life is shunning worldliness, self-denial to the point of willing martyrdom, as Antony stood in solidarity with the persecuted. It entails boldness and fearlessness in battle against the devil. It entails meekness and virtue in his view of himself. And it entails a fervent love of Jesus, which actually is driving them in all of their action. The Life of Antony is a book for the ages, as it became an enormous bestseller in its own time, and perhaps the most famous heart touched and convicted by it was Augustine's. And in the Confessions, how many of you have read the Confessions? Okay, so in the Confessions, you know that there is a point, a very pivotal point before Augustine is converted, where he learns about the life of Antony. So one day, as the pre-converted Augustine was talking to a friend named Ponticianus about how he was reading the Bible, right? His friend enthusiastically began telling him about the life of Antony, of whom Augustine had never heard to that point. Augustine found it astonishing and remarkable. It was a witness of God's power in his own time, as it were. The friend, Ponticianus, describes how he himself came to know about Antony during his time abroad in Trier with some other civil servants who were in the imperial escort. So he says that strolling about one day, they came to a small monastic community, maybe in a private residence near the city walls, and inside they found a copy of the Life of Antony. And this book revolutionized their lives to the point that they decided immediately to renounce their worldly ambitions and career hopes and follow God, devoting themselves to the ascetic life. One of them began reading it and was so fascinated. This is Augustine's words. He was so fascinated and thrilled by the story that even before he had finished reading, he conceived the idea of taking upon himself the same kind of life and abandoning his career in the world in order to become your servant. He's speaking to the Lord. This man expressed his desire to his partner, and he turned back to the book, again Augustine, laboring under the pain of the new life that was taking birth in him. He read on, and in his heart, where you alone could see, a change was taking place. His mind was being divested of the world. And his friend, inspired and moved by the rewards of this kind of life, determined to convert as well. So Augustine is listening to this story, and it's a little bit amusing as you read it. As Augustine listened to this story, a change was taking place in him as well, a pivotal moment leading up to his conversion in the Milanese garden. I think we would call this a moment of very strong conviction by the Spirit. So as Ponticianus was still telling the story, Augustine kind of zoned out a little bit, and he kind of took a look inside of himself. While he was speaking, O Lord, you were turning me around to look at myself. So he's hearing about Antony, and he's comparing himself. For I had placed myself behind my own back, refusing to see myself. You were setting me before my own eyes so that I could see how sordid I was, how deformed and squalid, how tainted with ulcers and sores. I saw it all and stood aghast. But there was no place where I could escape from myself. If I tried to turn my eyes away, they fell on Ponticianus, still telling his story. And in this way, you brought me face to face with myself once more, forcing me upon my own sight so that I should see my wickedness and loathe it. I had known it all along, but I had always pretended that it was something different. I turned a blind eye and forgotten it. Wow. I like how he's so spiritually self-aware and willing to admit, his sinfulness and his delusion. Now, Augustine wasn't looking to be a monk at all. I mean, I put here not necessarily, actually not at all, but he was convicted by his love of the world. He was convicted by his love of satisfaction of the flesh and by his high ambitions that were never high enough. They were never enough to make him truly happy, knowing that he was actually the slave of all the things that he loved. So those attachments, those addictions are the places where he was convicted by the life of this simple, unassuming monk who never set out to change the world or be in any way known by it. And therefore, through his life of meek illustriousness and humble renown, Antony connects two theological giants of East and West, Athanasius and Augustine. Wow. There's also testimony to Antony's life and deeds and reputation by early church historians. This really interests me because I'm very interested in historiography. Church historians that are contemporary with Augustine. I just mentioned these very quickly. Socrates Scholasticus, who's writing around AD 438, had read the life of Antony, and he wrote about many other monastics who practiced the ascetic desert life. Sozomen Scholasticus, who was writing in the 440s, had read Socrates and had also read Athanasius' Life of Antony, which he actually summarizes quite accurately in detail and at length in his church history. It's actually funny to have the book in your hand and then read a contemporary account who also has read the same book. It's a little bit surreal. You don't have to agree with me. These accounts are helpful to contextualize and to place Antony within the monastic movement, basically at the head of the monastic movement, although there are others too who are practicing at the same time. And it places Antony among the great figures of that movement. And it also points out how the church perceived these hermits as standing in the line of Elijah and John the Baptist. So as we approach this text and this man, we should ask the question, why did Athanasius write it and to whom? So by uncovering its themes, we can assume that there were many who were inspired to emulate Antony. They aspired to holiness themselves through purification in the desert. And also there were some who desired the fruits or the benefits of holiness. And what I mean by that is the worldly benefits of holiness. There are all kinds that come to the religious life and come to the spiritual guru and, who come to the apostles like Simon the magician, right? He had his own reasons for coming to the apostles after they performed their miracles. So they wanted to experience the worldly benefits of this life in the desert, a far-flung reputation as a holy man, powers of miraculous healings and exorcisms, the favor of rich and powerful people like the emperor, for example, and also outstanding wisdom so as to be sought out as a popular spiritual director. What they did not want necessarily was what had gotten Antony to that point, which was utter humility, self-abasement, self-denial. They're not really interested in that. Focusing on God and never self, shunning attention and popularity, desiring to focus only on Jesus and serving him faithfully and extending these virtues consistently over a vast amount of time. I don't think he knew he was going to live 105 years, but he knew that he had to just be consistent and faithful all of that time. I imagine that many may have been disappointed to hear Antony's advice because they had ambitions. And in fact, the assertion of Peter Brown, who was an Augustine scholar and an asceticism scholar, his assertion is very apt, referring to what was to come in the monastic movement. He says, despite elaborate self-abasement, some hope to be stars. Yeah. So the life of Antony is divided into 4 sections. Antony's beginnings in the ascetic life, his training. Next, Antony's teachings on discipleship and demonic warfare. Next, his work for others, including his solidarity with martyrs and his willingness to teach and train monks and to minister to people through healing and prayer. And finally, his last years, to include his service to the church and his death. Now, the second 2 sections might be surprising if we're under the impression that Antony was just an old hermit in the desert who just stayed out there for 100 years, just him and the rocks and the sand and the ostriches, etc. But as we'll see, his ministry turned exactly on the theme that we're treating today, which is the flip side of martyrdom, which is a lifelong spiritual devotion and set apartness and availability to whatever the Lord wills. So, let's talk about Antony's actual life. Antony was born around 251. Just to situate that, he was born at a time right at the time, or maybe on the tail end of the first empire-wide persecution under the Emperor Decius. Right? 251. He was born around 251 into a relatively well-off Coptic Christian family. He apparently had a rudimentary education, but he didn't pursue advanced studies. Interestingly, Athanasius redeems this deficit by using it to make the point that this holy man was a precocious child, and he was given a supernatural gift of discernment, evincing startling rhetorical skills that later proved capable of confounding even learned Greeks that came out to, try to mess with the old man in the desert. At the age of 20, he and his sibling, a sister, were orphaned. Antony felt the call of God initially through Jesus' words to the rich young ruler, Matthew 19, and later through his exhortation to the crowds following him to not be anxious about tomorrow. Antony accordingly placed his sister with a community of older women, and he sought out an older ascetic mentor to whom he could apprentice himself, and he withdrew to the solitary life. First, he practiced asceticism near home at the edge of his village with some other solitaries. And later, around the age of 35, he moved farther into the desert and he lived in a tomb, I guess a large tomb, eating very sparsely. As his fame spread on account of his friends and curious visitors, he moved even farther into the desert, shunning attention as an intrusion on his solitude. He set up his dwelling in a deserted fortress at the foot of a mountain where he remained for about 20 years. And in that place, he experienced a fruitful ministry of practicing the spiritual life, occasionally traveling to teach groups of monks and strengthening communities that had begun to establish themselves and build monastic dwellings in the desert. A significant portion of Athanasius' life of Antony contains Antony's various teachings to his disciples on asceticism and the spiritual life. The persecution of Maximinus Dea in around 312 brought Antony back to Alexandria to strengthen and support the confessors and the martyrs. Antony would have been approximately 60 years old then. His fame spread like wildfire, and people increasingly sought him out, specifically for his prayers, for his power to heal, for his counsels on the spiritual life. At that point, the Lord spoke to him, as to Elijah, and led him even further into the desert to a spot at the foot of a mountain, a remote place that became known as the Inner Mountain. There, Antony made his home for the rest of his life, approximately 45 more years. Wow. Leaving his place occasionally to visit and encourage the monks in the outer hills. And he also left his place once to go back into Alexandria to counter Arian allegations that Antony endorsed their doctrines. So he came out in support of Athanasius at the time of the Arian controversy. After a lifetime of practicing asceticism, of receiving and encouraging and ministering in various ways to visitors and teaching disciples by sharing his wisdom and his visions, he felt his time was at an end, having reached 105 years. His thoughts turned to the manner of death and the import of a particular Egyptian burial custom, which he rejected. The author's emphasis on issues surrounding this burial custom indicates its importance for that context and for his specific hagiographical concerns. In great humility, Antony insisted that he be buried in the ground and not be embalmed and kept in a house to have his body venerated, as was the Egyptian custom at that time for holy men and especially for the martyrs. Antony died around 356. So let's turn then to the ways that we see set out for us in the life of Antony. So the first way is the way of dying daily. The way of discipleship is a way of dying daily. This is the way of asceticism from the Greek word askesis, which refers to training as an athlete. And our word athlete comes from athletes, from Greek, which means preparing and strengthening for combat in a contest, which word is agon, where we get the word agony, okay? So These are some of the same terms that were associated with the trials of the martyrs in the martyrologies. As the martyrs had fulfilled their discipleship by enduring physical suffering, later Christians denied themselves and died to themselves daily. So, what is one's goal in ascetic training? In the practice of asceticism, one struggles against the passions that are stirred up in the soul, attempting to still them so that one is undistracted by inner noise and self-focused desires, and consequently free to hear God and to be attuned to God and to follow God in obedience, practicing virtue by God's grace and experiencing God's presence and blessing. This is the goal of asceticism, not to be hailed as a spiritual superhero. Asceticism's chief concern, therefore, was spiritual formation, and it was intended for every Christian who wished to persevere in the life of virtue, not just the clergy, not just for pastors. Okay, it's for everybody. So, regarding this life of struggle and virtue, Antony's voice and Antony's witness advises us, I'd say, in two different ways that I think are very encouraging. First of all, he advises us to always start fresh every day in our discipleship, because you and I mess up all the time. I'll just speak for myself. I mess up all the time. So always start fresh every day in our discipleship. Here's a quote from the life of Antony. He had also this strange seeming principle. He held that not by length of time is the way of virtue measured and our progress in it, but by desire and by strong resolve. Accordingly, he himself gave no thought to the time gone by, but each day, as though then beginning his religious life, he made greater effort to advance, constantly repeating to himself St. Paul's saying, forgetting the things that are behind and reaching out to the things that are before, Philippians 3. Keeping in mind, too, the voice of Elijah, the prophet, who said, the Lord liveth, before whose sight I stand this day, in 1 Kings 17. For he observed that in saying this day, he did not count the time gone by, but as though always making a beginning, he was earnest each day to present himself such as one ought to appear before God, clean of heart and ready to obey his will and none other. And he used to say within himself that from the way of life of the great Elijah, a religious man must always study his own way of life as in a mirror. End quote. So daily self-denial also prevents our spiritual life from becoming careless and negligent. This is especially evident in Antony's teachings about pursuing the life of virtue. It involves an active pursuit of the good, exercising one's free agency, and taking responsibility for making wise choices. So citing Romans 8:28 and 1 Corinthians 15:31, where Paul says, I die daily, Antony advised, if we also live so as dying daily, we shall not sin. In other words, living virtuously one day at a time. Having made a beginning, he says, and set out on the way of virtue, let us stretch out yet more to reach the things that are before us, and let none turn back to their life in the world. Rather, he tells us to persevere, since virtue is not so far away from us. As Jesus says, the kingdom of heaven is within you. All right, so everyday discipleship. Okay, start fresh every day. Second, I think what Antony shows us is that we need to be prepared to die for real if God wills it. So self-mortification is one thing, and real mortification, like death, is another. Be prepared for either one. Here again is a quote from the life of Antony. In 312, well, this is before the quote. In 312, there was the persecution that I mentioned to you under Maximinus Dea, and the Bishop Peter of Alexandria was taken into custody. When the holy martyrs were taken to Alexandria, Antony also left his monastery and followed, saying, let us too go, that we may suffer if we are called, or else we may look on the sufferers. He had a longing to be martyred, but not wishing to give himself up, He ministered to the confessors in the mines and in the prisons. In the hall of judgment, he was full of zeal for those who were called. For this, the judge banned monks from viewing the proceedings and also just banned monks from the city. But Antony showed himself all the more. Antony himself, Athanasius says, stood fearless, showing the eagerness that belongs to us Christians. He himself mourned because he was not martyred, but God was keeping him to help us and others, that to many he might be a teacher of the strict life that he had himself learned from the scriptures. For simply at seeing his behavior, many were eager to become followers of his way of life. When later the persecution ceased and the Bishop Peter, of blessed memory, had died a martyr, Antony returned to his monastery and abode there. Listen to what he's called, a daily martyr to conscience, fighting the fights of the faith. Right? This is the flip side of martyrdom, right? A daily martyr to conscience, fighting the fights of the faith. All right, so the way of discipleship is the way of self-denial. Number 2, the way of discipleship is the way of humility, and I would add purity of heart. Athanasius intended to lay out a model of the ideal ascetic, and Antony definitely set a high standard. And he doesn't expect all monks to achieve this standard, but we can hear Athanasius through the text clearly addressing some elements that aspiring monks needed to hear. The way of humility and purity of heart builds on the previous point. One must show humility in accepting God's calling to him, not to die a public death. I mean, a martyr's death was considered something very glorious. So Antony had to show humility in accepting God's not calling him to die this death, but to return to his quiet and hidden private life. Even so, in this private life, he's not alone, but rather he's sought out by many. And Antony demonstrates the humility of true discipleship, and I would say true leadership, which lies in shunning celebrity and fame. He's at the height of his fame at this point after appearing in Alexandria, and he goes back. People are going out to him now like crazy. So shunning celebrity and fame, what exactly did celebrity look like for a monk? I mean, what kind of profile is that? Who goes into the monastic vocation to be a celebrity, right? Well, for monastics in the 4th century, celebrity looked like working superhuman miracles, having a renowned reputation as a holy person with lots of likes on your sanctity posts, always having a wise word to tweet out, having flocks of followers who listen raptly to your wisdom that confounds worldly wisdom, and having seekers retweet all those wise sayings. Celebrity looks like healings of deadly diseases, of powerful prayers, dramatic exorcisms, public veneration, and being sought out by famous leaders, political leaders, religious leaders, important leaders, whatever leaders, but important leaders. Celebrity looks like prophesying the future and receiving divine visions indicating the favor of God. Rather than reveling in all of these privileges, Antony shunned celebrity actively. So what does shunning celebrity look like? It looks like an uncomfortable rejection of attention and notoriety for deeds that a person knows belong to the power of God and do not stem from humans, no matter how faithful that Christian might be. Antony continuously deflected attention from himself towards Christ, making it clear that Christ was responsible for any miraculous deeds that Antony performed. He also empowered and encouraged people who came out to him with requests. He encouraged them to make their own efforts at prayer, to take their own steps of faith toward Christ and his power, to access the favor of Christ. And I like that he's very realistic about this all the way around. He's saying it's not me and my power, but you can ask for it as well. But he basically indicates to people there's no guarantees. God will do what God will do. I could pray for you, but that doesn't mean God will answer in the way that you want. And you could also pray for you, and that also means that God might not answer in the way you want, but then he might, right? It's not because of me. So deflecting celebrity, deflecting attention. By shunning celebrity, Antony is teaching people about the power and prerogatives of God and how to put holy men and all men in perspective. Antony felt so strongly about shunning celebrity that he packed up and determined to move even further into the desert until, as with Elijah, the Lord asked him, "Antony, where are you going and why?" Athanasius explained that Antony was anxious lest from what the Lord did through him, he himself should be lifted up, or another person should think about him above the truth, like more than what's true. And Antony replied to the Lord, "They ask things beyond my power." Antony's humility is also connected to purity of heart. He's a man without pretense, and he's always been so throughout Athanasius's account. Athanasius mentions several times that Antony's eyes are very clear because of the purity of his soul. You know how sometimes we say that the eyes are windows into the soul? Okay, so his eyes are very clear and he sees clearly because his soul is pure. He has, with alacritous and sincere obedience, followed God into this vocation from the start. The life he lives to God in the wilderness is a sincere calling. And whether it is Antony's view or Athanasius's portrayal in the retelling, it's clear that this lifestyle is not seen by the church as non-biblical. It's not seen as running away, but it's admired and affirmed. In Antony's withdrawal, there is no mention of the kinds of things that we read about as the reasons for the monastic movement. Okay? In this account, though, there's no mention of flight from persecution, although there was persecution at the time. There's no mention of dodging the IRS on paying taxes on all that real estate that his parents left him, because he was left a lot of land. And there's no mention of fleeing a compromised church and wishy-washy Christianity. No mention of those things at all. I found it very odd. Surprising, not odd, surprising. All his movements of progressive withdrawal have, rather, biblical reference. He didn't want to go to school. He wished to stay at home with his parents, living a quiet life, like Jacob. He sold all that he had, 300 acres, to follow Jesus, as Jesus had called the rich young ruler, though he kept a little to provide for his sister. And when he heard Matthew 6:34, not to worry about tomorrow, he gave this money away too, convicted by Jesus' words. He performed manual labor, taught by 2 Thessalonians 3:10, whoever doesn't work, let him not eat. He prayed without ceasing, and in humility, he made himself really subject. He subjected himself, he submitted himself to all from whom he could learn virtue. All who knew him called him a man of God and loved him as a son or as a brother, except the devil. The very next line after Antony's great virtue and how everybody loved him says, "But the devil, the hater and envier of good, could not bear to see such resolution in a young man, but attempted to use against him the means in which he is skilled," which then leads us to our next point. The way of discipleship is a battle to the last breath. One of the most striking features of the life of Antony is the demonology that it offers. And in doing so, Athanasius gives a behind-the-scenes look at why asceticism is necessary. The spiritual reality behind the struggle against the flesh and the devil. There is no pretense that the spiritual life is easy or uncomplicated or always pleasant. You don't just walk an aisle and everything's good, right? You don't just take the pastor's hand, say a prayer, and it's great. Now you're in the kingdom of heaven, okay? There's nothing like that evident here. There's a direct acknowledgement and a forceful denunciation of the prince of the powers of the air and of the powers and principalities around us. Also of the reality of the sin that so easily entangles us, of the lion that prowls ready to devour, 1 Peter 5, and of the one who has the power over death, Hebrews 2. Engaging in this struggle involves the previous 2 points. Dying to self means living intentionally and actively towards God and exercising personal agency in our own sanctification. And the way of humility means knowing and acknowledging God's agency and grace in spiritual victories. Antony advised fearlessness in the face of demonic attack and demonic activity. He evidences a heightened perception of the demonic, maybe a little bit too heightened. His teachings to his disciples focus on how to repulse these attacks. His teachings are drawn from his own experience. And perhaps this may be connected to some ideas in Athanasius' work on the incarnation. The devil is to be categorically repulsed and rebuked, not even allowed to speak. He deceived our first parents, corrupting their nature and robbing them of blessedness. And he now deceives pagans through idolatry. As he robbed humans of blessedness, he now deceives pagans through fear, making them bow in worship to him. But Christians know that the devil is defeated, and they do not cower or cringe or give trembling worship at all. Antony's example shows that although humans are weak and sinful, yet they can exercise free agency. And this is because, I don't have time to read you the passage, but this is because of the image of God that is stamped in us. That is how we are able to access free agency in order to make good and virtuous decisions and to participate in our own sanctification. Being sanctified by God and exercising their agency in a life of virtue, humans have resources and are not powerless against the forces of evil, and they have sure defenses. This defense then is located in the image of God that we bear, and Antony is an example of spiritual fortitude and resilience for the reader. Antony is given insight into the spiritual world. He sees the demons and spirits in the air that try to drag down sinners. In some way, as Jesus was crucified in the air to cleanse the air of evil spirits, this is Athanasius on the incarnation, so the monks' prayers out in the desert somehow are cleansing the air, are purifying the air for those who dwell in the cities. This is how the importance of the monastic vocation came to be seen in future centuries as a result of this constant struggle against the devil. And finally, the way of discipleship is the way of love. It's very clear in this account that loving Jesus is considered by Antony to be the greatest thing, that there is nothing greater than love for Jesus. And he advises his disciples, don't ever turn back to your previous life, i.e., don't ever turn away from Jesus. It's important to love the church, to love the clergy, to love the brothers. Antony is respectful to all clergy, even, the life says, even to deacons, like the lower clergy. So although sometimes these two worlds of clergy and monks seem to be maybe at odds, but it's not surprising that Athanasius the bishop portrays Antony, the ideal monk, as respectful to the clergy. The third thing he says is loving the scriptures is important. Loving the scriptures is a sublime thing. The scriptures are powerful in our battle against the devil, and we must know and memorize and share scripture one with another for encouragement and edification and for our very life, to sustain our very spiritual life. And finally, loving and empowering and serving the needy is an imperative in the Christian life. So as we conclude, here are some things to think about. Antony's life witness, his martyria, is complete and available to us in paperback as an instructive example. Can we learn the lessons Antony embodied and that Athanasius gleaned and passed on to us? Yes, we must learn to die daily, to follow Christ in self-denying discipleship. And that's kind of an oxymoron too, because that's the very definition and essence of discipleship is self-denial, isn't it? We must do so, not because Antony or Athanasius said so, but because it's biblical. We must follow the way of humility, shunning the temptation and scourge of celebrity culture that seeks celebrity from without and creates it for oneself in clear contradiction to the way of self-denial. It is dangerous, leads to hubris and vainglory, and gives the devil an open door to ruin us, our witness, and our ministry work. We will undoubtedly walk the way of spiritual struggle because the devil is a roaring lion who prowls around everywhere, and we cannot hope to escape his attacks. But Antony gives the hope of Christ's firm assistance through his powerful name, through his completed work on the cross, having defeated the devil already, and through the power of the knowledge of the scriptures. These are our sure defenses. Finally, and most importantly, will we walk in the way of love? It's not difficult to love Jesus as he first loved us and continues to love us and to reveal the Father to us and invite us into union with himself through the Holy Spirit. But can we love our neighbor? Can we help and pray for our neighbors? Can we extend kindness and graciousness and hospitality to them? Can we encourage and empower them to grow and progress in their spiritual lives? These were Antony's ways, left as an example for us. Athanasius concludes Antony's life with these words: that he was everywhere spoken of and by all admired and sought, even by those who had not seen him. These things are proof of his virtue and of a soul dear to God. For Antony was known not for his writings, not for worldly wisdom, nor for any art, but simply for his service of God. For though they themselves act in secret and wish to be unnoticed, yet the Lord shows his servants as lanterns to us all, that even from this the hearers may know that the commandments are able to be fulfilled. This is the point of his example. You can do it. You can walk this way of virtue. You can fulfill the commandments, and so may take courage on the path of virtue. So let's ask ourselves, if our ways were widely known, would people respond by taking us as an example of the virtuous life, as Augustine and many others through the ages have responded to the life of Antony? It's a question that each one of us must seriously take to heart. Thank you.